Today we are talking about chapter 12, Turning Points. So it's your textbook, page 93. So here, there are 10 significant events that happened in human history. Do you know what happened first? Can you put them in the right order? Let's look at these events one by one, okay? So the first one, first picture of Earth from lunar orbit, the moon. So since the first successful landing on the moon by Armstrong, the famous astronaut, so I would guess around 1960s. And then number two, founding of UN, United Nations. The purpose was to maintain the world peace, right? Okay, so yeah, right after the Second World War. And number three, Russian Revolution. Yeah, I know exactly. It happened during the First World War I, so early in the 20th century. At that time, Russia was still an empire, and that was part of the reason, or the main reason, they quit participating in the war. And then Beatlemania. So people are crazy about the Beatles. I would say early 1960s. And the first women getting the votes. So after the First World War, a lot of movements, a lot of women's movements, okay, they want to get the right to vote, or there's a term called suffrage, yeah, the right to vote. And the fall of Berlin Wall, the two Germanys, East Germany and West Germany, reunited in 1990s. Yeah. And then atomic bomb, we know that that was the direct reason that ended the Second World War, right? Yeah. And then 9/11, there will be a more recent one that happened early in this century. And the invention of the cell phone, I guess people in Taiwan started to use a cell phone in the 1980s. And then discovery of penicillin. It must have happened before the Second World War. And then people say the discovery or the invention was actually an accident. And some people even call this as a gift from the God. Okay, so let's check if we are right in that. So please turn to page 170. Okay, so the first event, Russian Revolution. The revolution in 1917 ended the reign of the Tsars and created the communist Soviet Union. This was the beginning of the division of the globe into communist and non-communist blocs, which came to its height in the Cold War after World War I. Okay, so revolution. Sometimes people are not very satisfied with the government, so they want to overthrow the government. So in Russia, the emperor Tsars, and then at the time, some people, they kind of like stood up for the working class or the communists, and then they successfully overthrew the government in the year 1917. So they ended the rule, the reign, right, of the emperor, and then created the new government, the system, communism, communist Soviet Union. And it was actually the beginning of the division. Okay, so the different government systems are divided into two blocks. One is communism, the other would be non-communism, democracy. And then the two superpowers, Russia or Soviet Union, okay, representing communism, and then the USA for democracy. And then there was a long period of Cold War between the two superpowers, right? Okay. And then next will be women's vote. there were some minor instances of women receiving the vote in small communities prior to 1918. Women were also allowed to vote in post-revolutionary Russia in 1917, but the first real wave of countries giving women the vote came in 1918 after World War I. The struggle to get the vote was the beginning of what developed into the feminist movement. Okay, so before the First World War ended, okay, in some areas, women were actually given the right to vote, but a real wave, a strong wave worldwide, okay, didn't start until the end of First World War. So later then, because the the First World War ended in 1918, okay, and then followed by a lot of movements, women's movements, okay, for the right to vote, and then it developed, okay, a lot of other women's or feminist movements. They want to get more freedom, liberation, etc. like this. And then Alexander Fleming, he was the scientist that discovered penicillin. And penicillin was the first antibiotic. Okay, so before that people might die from if they got the bacterial infection, and then there was no way to solve the problem. Okay, and as I mentioned earlier, okay, some people actually call penicillin as a gift from the God because it was actually discovered by accident. So that happened in 1928, but then stopped work on it because it was too difficult to produce large enough quantities that would keep for very long. So there was something, technically speaking, to be broken through. Because if they manufacture large quantities of penicillin, they were not able to preserve it for a long time. Okay, so it was not until 1944. Okay, so its introduction on a mass scale. Okay, people started to manufacture in a lot of big quantities. Okay, it was not until 1944, and that was exactly the time when during the time of the Second World War, right? Okay, so that kind of saved thousands of lives because of soldiers, okay, because of a fight. You can assume that a lot of injuries were done, and some could be pretty bad, right? Yeah. And the subsequent development of other antibiotics revolutionized the medicine. So they kind of like set the foundation for the future medicine, okay, technology, like that medical technology. And then the atomic bomb. The first successful test detonation was on July 16th, 1945, in the New Mexico desert. So they started to test this bomb. Okay, so detonation means the explosion in the desert. Okay, and later on, the world woke up to the reality and the horror of the atomic bomb after it was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. We all know that at first the USA didn't get involved in the Second World War, but then when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, right, by surprise, and kind of like the USA lost face, and then they needed to get a revenge. And then I guess the USA didn't realize the power of the atomic bomb, and then it was so powerful that Japan couldn't stand it, so Japan surrendered. Okay, so that was the reason that ended the Second World War, right? And then after that, nuclear weapons, so people started to develop even more deadly, fatal weapons like nuclear weapons, right? Have proliferated, have increased a lot. And it can be argued, why would you develop a nuclear weapon? It's too dangerous, right? Okay, but people might argue that we act this, okay, as a deterrent to the escalation of conflicts. Okay, war happens because of conflicts between nations, right? Okay, so deterrent is something to deter, the verb to deter, to curb, to prevent, right? Okay, also if people know we have nuclear weapons, they will be so afraid they would dare not declare war, right? I think it's very ironical. Personally, I definitely don't agree with this. It just, people say something like, if you want peace, prepare for war. That's very paradoxical, I think. Yeah. All right, so the escalation, okay, you take the escalator to go up, upstairs maybe, so it's like going up, okay, the conflicts getting too much, okay, so out of control. So people say, oh, we need to develop nuclear weapon, okay, to curb that, all right? But their shadow will always hand over humanity. That's absolutely something. It's a disaster. Wars kill, hurt so many people, right? Yeah. So that would leave some kind of trauma on our minds. And then the founding of the UN. Preparations for the formation of the United Nations began in April 1945, but it wasn't founded until October of that year. Okay, we all know that during the Second World War, the U.S. president was Roosevelt. Okay, so he was one of the people that helped to initiate, to prepare UN, but then he died before it came into reality. Yeah. So yeah, in 1945, okay, right after the Second World War, UN was founded. The influence of the UN has often been seen as disappointing, okay, kind of like it didn't function as it wishes, it hopes, okay, to maintain world peace. There are still a lot of conflicts, not to mention wars around, right? Okay, but it's a profound symbol of progress on the international stage. Okay, for us, of course, we can be disappointed that Taiwan with a population of 23 million, but we are not a member of UN, right? Okay, and then Beatlemania. Okay, so although the craze for rock and roll began in the 1950s with Elvis Presley, fan hysteria for the Beatles in the early 60s was on a much wider global scale. Okay, you know about Elvis Presley. He got a nickname, the King of Rock and Roll, right? Yeah, but then after him, okay, the Beatles, the band, okay, they appeared, and then they had more fans around the globe. Okay, so wider in a global scale. Okay, so British Beatlemania began in late 1963 and spread across the Atlantic in 1964. Okay, so Beatles, the hometown was Liverpool, right? England, and then the fame, the craze spread, okay, internationally across the Atlantic Ocean. Of course, there's the ocean that separated Europe and the USA. So when they first arrived in the USA, okay, the fans were just crazy. The Beatles were greeted at JFK International Airport in New York City, so John F. Kennedy Airport, by thousands of screaming women especially. They were so excited, right? So they screamed, okay. Yeah, I suppose at that time the Beatles, they were like young guys, right? Yeah, pretty young. And then older generations might disapprove of this, right? This kind of wild, uncontrollable behavior of the females. Okay, so they will show their disapproval. They might shake their head. Oh no, what happened to them? Are they crazy? Are they out of their mind? Okay, yeah. And the concept of the rebellious teenager was established. Okay, but of course, both, okay, Elvis Presley and the Beatles, okay, many artists, many musicians, they actually claim, they say they were inspired, yeah, by either Elvis Presley or the Beatles, yeah, so they got a lot of influence on the music world. And speaking about the Beatles, I think the most famous of them would be John Lennon, right? And what happened to John Lennon? He was assassinated, he was murdered in America. At the time, actually, he was already retired. But then some people started to talk to him to persuade him into coming back on stage. They said, come on, you are still young, okay? You shouldn't retire so young, okay? So, yeah, he was preparing to come back. But then the tragedy happened, yeah. And then the first picture of Earth from lunar orbit, Apollo 8, the rocket, took man out of Earth's orbit for the first time in December 1968. And the pictures taken of the Earth from over 200,000 miles away in the outer space, right? Changed the way its inhabitants, we inhabit the Earth, we are the inhabitants. So a picture taken from the outer space, okay, make us see ourselves and our environment in a different angle, okay. And then, of course, they also started the research of the outer space, right? Yeah. And then the invention of the cell phone. In the early 1970s, Martin Cooper led a team of Motorola, okay, a very famous telephone company. The Motorola teams of Motorola engineers that developed the first handheld cell phone. So we call that cell phone, cellular phone, mobile phone, because you can go wherever and you can have the phone in your hand. You have phone conversations, right? On April 3rd, 1973, he made the very first cell phone call in public, which was to Dr. Joe S. Engel, head of Bell Labs, the laboratory, I guess, and Bell was actually the inventor of telephone, right? Yeah. And a major competitor, okay, so another company, okay, they compete with each other. So a company with the very similar field, okay, so another phone producing company, I guess. And the first cell phone were the size of a brick, weigh about 2 pounds and cost, wow, 3,000, almost 4,000 US dollars. Okay, we know that, right? The first cell phone, okay, was very heavy and very big, okay, the size of a brick, and then almost 2 pounds, okay. It's so expensive too, almost 4,000 US dollars. Wow, so only rich businessmen at that time could afford to own a cell phone. But then, you know, like communication has come a long way, right? Okay, so right now we use smartphones, and then there are so many functions with our smartphones, right? And there are a lot of very handy apps for us to use, right? Yeah. And then the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall came down on November 9th, 1989. The wall had been the ultimate symbol of the Cold War, and when Germany was reunited in 1990. Okay, so after the Second World War, and then people started to build Berlin Wall. Okay, so they separated Germany into East Germany and West Germany, and then the world was divided into 2 parts. Okay, so East Germany all the way to Eastern Europe and to Russia. There was a huge Soviet Union. The location, geographically speaking, Russia was located part of Asia, part of Europe, right? And then to the west, Berlin, okay, democratic countries, England, France, and then all the way to across the Atlantic Ocean. The U.S., of course, was another superpower, and there was some time that between Russia and the USA, they got very cold relationships. They were no more friends. They refused to have interaction with each other, right? And then, by the way, when talk about the political systems were divided into communism and democracies, right? There were actually some countries where neither communism nor democracy applied. Then we call this kind of country, we can call it as the third world, right? The third world, yeah. So the fall of the Berlin Wall, okay, it carries a kind of symbol, okay. So it was seen as the end of communism in Europe, okay. So no more communism in Europe. So all the other countries in Eastern Europe, like Hungary, like Poland, okay, they got independence from Russia. So now it's just Russia, it's not Soviet Union anymore. The collapse of the Soviet Union followed the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the dynamics of global politics changed forever. And now there are not so many countries where the government system is communism, right? Yeah. And then 9/11 attack, the most recent one. The terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in New York City began early on September 11th, 9/11, 2001. Okay, people call it a terrible terrorist, Bin Laden, right? Bin Laden. When hijacked airliners were flown into the Twin Towers, okay, so some terrorists, they will try to hijack an airline, right? Airplane, aircraft, okay, and then they would command the pilots to fly wherever they wanted him to fly to, okay. So over the Twin Towers in New York City, so it was kind of like suicidal terror attack, right? Yeah. And the event traumatized all who witnessed it. So not to mention people who witnessed it, okay. Even what we are here in Taiwan, when we watch the reports through TV news, okay, it was really, really shocking. The sight was very shocking, okay. So that leave some kind of traumatized people, okay. So nowadays, earlier this year, when in Taiwan we had the tragic accident of the trains, okay. So people mention about this term again, right? PTSD, yeah, as a post traumatic stress disorder, right? Yeah. So this event traumatized all the witnesses, okay. And then the U.S. government's subsequent war on terror led to the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. Again, the USA couldn't lose the face, right? Yeah. So they declared war to these Middle Eastern countries. Yeah. And then following 9/11 attack, air passengers are reminded of this event whenever they go through airport security. Following 9/11 attack, the security before you want to board your plane, okay, is very, very strict, okay. So you are not allowed to bring water, right? Not liquid. And then you might have to take off your jackets, even your shoes, right, for inspection. Yeah. So 9/11 attack, they made us people getting alert, okay, worried about that terrorist attack through hijacking, okay. So they got more tighter, security check this way. All right, so today we talk about the 10 significant events that happened in human history. So in your opinion, which has the greatest impact on the future generation? Okay, would you leave your message? Okay, so thank you for watching.